Good morning, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. I'm here with Bhante Suddhaso, who will be sharing a teaching with us for Sutta study, Majjhima Nikaya 37. Is that correct, Bhante?
38.
38. All right. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Bhante Suddhaso. Thank you, Bhante.
So we'll start by paying homage to the Buddhas. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So this morning we'll be looking at the Maha Tanhasankhaya Sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 38, which is translated here as the greater discourse on the complete elimination of craving. So this is a relatively long sutta that touches on many important topics. So I'll be skimming through some parts of the sutta relatively quickly, and then paying a bit more attention to certain aspects of it. And we'll be doing this sutta in two parts since it's on the longer side. So today I'll go through about half of the discourse, and then tomorrow I'll go through the second half. As usual, please feel free to type in questions at any time, and I'll answer them at the end. So as usual, also I'll read through the sutta and periodically give some explanations, focusing on particularly important points that need to be clarified. So the sutta begins. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Savatthi at Jeta's Grove in Anathapindika's park. Now on this occasion, this kind of harmful perspective had arisen in the mind of a monk named Sati, the fisherman's son. As I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, it is this very consciousness which wanders in samsara and nothing else. So this is the wrong view that this monk had. So he had this view that our vijnana, our consciousness, vijnana in Pali, wanders from life to life, goes from life to life. So the other four khandhas are temporary and impermanent and conditional and dependent upon a particular life, but that our vijnana, our consciousness, is the persistent, ongoing entity which moves from life to life. So that's where our self resides, is in our consciousness. This is basically the viewpoint that he was upholding. But of course, this is contrary to the Dhamma. So the sutta continues that many monks heard about Sati's wrong view. They went to him and asked him, is this actually what you believe? And he confirms that's his belief. So then those monks say to him, Venerable Sati, don't speak in that way. Don't misrepresent the Blessed One. It is not good to misrepresent the Blessed One. Venerable Sati, consciousness has been spoken of in many ways by the Blessed One as conditionally arisen. Consciousness does not exist apart from its cause. While Sati was being spoken to in this way, he stubbornly held to his viewpoint. So first off, saying consciousness is dependently arisen, the Pali word for this is paticca samuppannang. So paticca samuppannang, this is the past participle form of paticca samuppada. So dependent co-arising or dependent origination, conditional manifestation, it goes by different translations. Dependent origination is probably the most common. So the point that they're making here is that you cannot separate consciousness from its cause. And when those causes and conditions are absent, then consciousness is also absent. So what they're pointing to here is that vijnana, consciousness, has the same momentary nature as all other phenomena. It has the same nature of arising temporarily, dependent on causes and conditions, and ceasing based upon the cessation of those causes and conditions. And this is a process which we can see happening in a moment-by-moment basis. In each moment, there's the arising of consciousness based upon causes and conditions, and the ceasing of consciousness based upon the alteration of those causes and conditions. So you can't even draw a thread of a persistent consciousness in this very life, let alone a thread of persistent consciousness throughout multiple lives. But Venerable Sati was persistent in holding on to his viewpoint. So the other monks went to the Buddha and bowed to the Buddha, sat to one side, and reported to the Buddha what had happened. And so the Buddha says to them, he says, go and summon Sati Bhikkhu with my words. Venerable Sir, the teacher summons you. In the suttas, this is usually a bad sign. When the Buddha calls you in personally, that's usually a sign that he doesn't approve of something you've been doing or something you've been thinking. So the monk goes to Venerable Sati and tells Sati to come and see the Buddha. So Sati comes to the Buddha, and the Buddha asks him, is this actually what you believe? And Sati replies to the Buddha, he says, Bhante, it is in this way that I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One. It is this very consciousness which wanders in samsara and nothing else. So reaffirming his viewpoint that consciousness is the carrier wave of self-identity. Consciousness is what persists throughout multiple lifetimes. And the Buddha questions him. He says, Sati, what is that consciousness? In other words, what is it that you're calling consciousness? So I find it interesting here that the Buddha begins this conversation by getting Sati to define his terms. And this is very important. So very often, especially when people are new to Buddhism, even if they've been practicing for many years, they'll often ask, what is consciousness? What is vijnana? What does this mean? And this is because the word consciousness in English is used to mean many different things, some of which is quite different from how it's used in a Buddhist context. So it's important always to start with a definition of terms so that we can be sure that we're actually talking about the same thing, to be sure that we understand each other. So the Buddha asks, Sati, what is that consciousness? And Sati replies, Bhante, it is what speaks and feels. It is what experiences in various ways the results of good and bad actions. So this is interesting as well because this is not how the Buddha defines the word vijnana. There's nowhere in the suttas where the Buddha defines consciousness as being that which speaks and feels or that which experiences the results of good and bad actions. Instead, the Buddha usually defines consciousness as being awareness of sensory fields, awareness of sensory domains. So visual consciousness, auditory consciousness, and so on, including mind consciousness. So awareness of a mental domain, a domain of mental objects and activities. But the Buddha never defines consciousness as being that which speaks and feels, or that which is the recipient of karma. So the Buddha says, foolish man, for whom do you recall the Dhamma having been taught by me in that way? In other words, he says, where do you remember me ever saying anything like that? The Buddha knows he's never said anything like that. He's never taught that consciousness was that which speaks and feels and receives karma. So he says, foolish man, haven't I spoken of consciousness in many ways as conditionally arisen, and that consciousness does not exist apart from its cause? So reaffirming what the other monks had previously said. And he says, foolish man, you misrepresent me using your own wrongly held opinion. You damage yourself and accumulate much demerit. Foolish man, this will lead to your long-term detriment and suffering. So in many places in the suttas, the Buddha talks about the various kinds of harmful actions. And the most harmful is wrong view. Because it's from wrong view that all other harmful actions arise. So wrong view is by far the most dangerous, the most harmful, the most destructive of the unwholesome actions of body, speech, and mind. Wrong view is by far the most dangerous and destructive. It's the one that we need to be most careful about. So the most important wholesome quality is right view. It's the most important quality to develop. And one element of right view is recognizing that consciousness is not ourself. Consciousness is not persistent. Consciousness is a temporary manifestation that is conditional like everything else. Therefore, it cannot be our true self, and it cannot be persistent. It cannot be the entity which moves from life to life. It cannot be the soul. It's simply something which arises and ceases like everything else. So it's interesting that even with suttas like this, which lay this out so clearly, even to this day, there are many Buddhist practitioners who still hold to the same wrong view that Sati held. They still hold to the wrong view that consciousness is our ground of being, that consciousness is our true self, that consciousness is what persists from life to life. So there's still this viewpoint to be found, taught by even by contemporary, highly respected Buddhist teachers. So this is another reason why it's so important to read the suttas. When we read the suttas, then we find that there are many suttas which are directly countermanding popular wrong views. Wrong views so popular that they keep cropping up for the past 2,500 years. People keep falling into the same wrong views that people fell into in the time of the Buddha. Still falling into the same wrong views, which the Buddha dismantled and rejected time and time again. So then the Buddha addressed the monks. So now he's saying to the other monks, he says, "Monks, what do you think? Has Sati Bhikkhu kindled even a spark of understanding in this Dhammavinaya?" And the other monks replied, "How could it be so, Bhante? Certainly not, Bhante." When this was said, Sati Bhikkhu sat silent, ashamed, slouching, face downcast, sullen, and unresponsive. So this is one of the teaching techniques that the Buddha would use, public shaming. So public shaming, sometimes people find public shaming a little bit uncomfortable. Sometimes they think it's inappropriate conduct. But it was something that the Buddha would use as a teaching tool from time to time. There are many suttas where the Buddha would publicly shame, especially monks, for misconduct, or especially, again, for wrong views. So on the other hand, the Buddha was also filled with infinite compassion and wisdom. So he would do this out of pure compassion. So there was no mean-spirited ill will in the Buddha. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone's feelings. He wasn't trying to cause harm by doing this. Quite the opposite. The Buddha was publicly shaming Venerable Sati for two reasons. One, to help Venerable Sati break free of his wrong views. And two, to communicate to all the other monks, as well as every recipient of the Buddhist heritage, right down to us in this day. He was trying to communicate to everybody else very clearly that it's wrong view to place self-identity on consciousness. It's wrong view to say that consciousness persists from life to life, or again, even from moment to moment, would still be wrong view. So then the Buddha says to Sati, he says, "Foolish man, you will be known by your own harmful perspective." And this is true. So even now, 2,500 years later, if you mention the name Sati, the fisherman's son, to Buddhist monks, then they'll be like, "Oh, he was that fool who thought that consciousness is a true self that persists from life to life." So Sati Bhikkhu is famous throughout the Buddhist world, and not for good reasons. Not for anything bright and honorable, but rather he's known to this day as being one of the many, many examples of somebody who thought that consciousness is true self. So the Buddha asked the other monks, he says, "Monks, do you recall the Dhamma having been taught by me in the way that Sati Bhikkhu misrepresents me using his own wrongly held opinion, damaging himself and accumulating much demerit?" So this is kind of a question that includes its own answer. So he says, "Do you remember me teaching the Dhamma the way this monk claims I did? The way he's misrepresenting me?" And the other ones say, "Certainly not, Bhante." And they reaffirm consciousness is conditionally arisen and does not exist apart from its cause. The Buddha says, "Good, good, monks," and he affirms again that consciousness is conditionally arisen, and that Sati is misrepresenting him, and that Sati's wrong view will lead to his own long-term harm. So then the Buddha launches into a description of consciousness. And this is where the sutta starts to become an exposition, where the Buddha's like, well, clearly these people aren't quite understanding what consciousness is. If Sati misunderstood consciousness, then others will also misunderstand it. So now the Buddha is giving a more thorough explanation of what he means by consciousness, so that there can be no misunderstanding. So he says, whatever condition consciousness arises in dependence on, it is in terms of that it is defined as consciousness. When consciousness arises in dependence on an eye and visual objects, it is defined as eye consciousness. When consciousness arises in dependence on an ear and sounds, it is defined as ear consciousness. And then the same with nose and fragrances, tongue and flavors, body and tangible objects, and mind and mental objects. So here the Buddha is speaking about the 6 kinds of sensory consciousness. So visual consciousness, auditory consciousness, and so on. So consciousness based upon eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. The 6 ways that consciousness arises. So here he's also pointing to the concept that consciousness is not something which is always existent, but rather consciousness arises when there is the presence of some kind of sensory ability. So when there is the ability to see things, then there can be eye consciousness, visual consciousness arising based upon that. He's also pointing here to the fact that consciousness depends upon the 6 sense bases. And the 6 sense bases depend upon the existence of body and mind. So he's pointing here again to the process of dependent origination. So the Buddha then asks a series of further questions. So I'm going to go through these questions because here the Buddha is laying out a sequence of logic. He says, "Monks, do you see that this has come into existence?" In other words, do you see that there is currently consciousness operating? And they reply, "Yes, Bhante." He says, "Monks, do you see that this exists because of that source?" In other words, so source here, by the way, is ahara. So ahara is commonly translated as nourishment or nutriment. So that which fuels or feeds something, which gives something the ability to exist. In other words, do you recognize that that consciousness has a particular source? It comes about because of some kind of nourishment. So consciousness has its own nourishment, its own food. It doesn't exist on its own. It exists because it has something which feeds it. And they reply, "Yes, Bhante." And the Buddha says, "Monks, do you see that with the cessation of that source, what has come into existence is also of the nature to cease?" And they reply, "Yes, Bhante." So here again, the Buddha is emphasizing. He's saying consciousness only comes into being because it has something which nourishes it, which gives it a reason to exist. And when that reason, that nourishment, that source is not present, when it ceases, then consciousness also ceases. In other words, in a moment when there is the existence of a body, and that body has functioning eyes, and there are some kind of visual objects within range of the eye, then based upon those sources, then that feeds the arising of eye consciousness, of visual awareness. But if any of those conditions change, for example, if there's nothing to see, or if one's eyes aren't working correctly, or if there's no body at all, then these are all conditions under which eye consciousness will cease to exist. So, for example, at the moment of death, this is a very clear example. At the moment of death, all of the 6 sense domains cease to exist. And yet, there is still karmic momentum, which will generate another life, will generate another body-mind with its own set of 6 senses. But that means that at the moment of death, consciousness also ceases, because it has no body or mind in order to feed it. It has no capacity for sensory experiences. So then, since there's no sensory experience, there can be no sensory consciousness. There can be no vijnana. And actually, again, this is happening in every moment, because in every moment, body and mind are constantly arising and ceasing, which means that in every moment, consciousness arises and ceases. It isn't persistent, but rather it's a momentary arising which immediately disappears. It comes and it goes on a moment-by-moment basis. Then the Buddha asks about the arising of doubt. He says, "Monks, does doubt arise from uncertainty about whether or not this has come into existence?" In other words, if one is confused about whether or not consciousness has manifested, whether or not consciousness has arisen, when one, for example, is not sure whether consciousness is a permanent, persistent thing, then that leads to doubt. Doubt about what? Doubt about the Dhamma, doubt about the Buddha's teachings, doubt about the temporary nature of all things. In other words, often we're not paying close enough attention to our experience to recognize that consciousness is a temporary phenomenon, which is constantly arising and ceasing. So when we're not paying close enough attention, then there appears to be persistent, ongoing consciousness. Again, one of the common contemporary metaphors that we use is of a video. So right now you're watching a video of a Dhamma talk. And it appears to be a persistent, ongoing, moving image on your screen. But if you have some awareness of technology, you know that this isn't true. You know that it's actually a series of individual frames, however many they use these days. 60 frames per second, I think, is relatively common these days. In other words, 60 individual photographs. So you're not actually seeing a video of me talking. What you're seeing is a series of individual photographs strung together so close together that it appears to be a moving, persistent image. So it's the same thing with consciousness. Because we're not paying close enough attention, we don't recognize that consciousness is a series of momentary arisings and ceasings, a series of momentary instants of consciousness. Instead, we just get this illusion of a single, ongoing, persistent consciousness. But if we pay close enough attention, then we can recognize the arising and ceasing of consciousness in each moment. And therefore, we will recognize that it is not a persistent, ongoing consciousness, but rather it's a series of individual, temporary moments of consciousness. And the Buddha continues, "Does doubt arise from uncertainty about whether or not this exists because of that source?" In other words, when you don't recognize that consciousness has a source, a particular cause, then again, you might not recognize that consciousness is dependent upon a particular cause. You might not recognize that consciousness relies upon something outside of itself, which means that consciousness is not self-existent. Consciousness cannot exist in and of itself. It can only exist when its particular causes and fuel is existing, when its causes and conditions are present. So since consciousness cannot exist of its own, consciousness cannot have its own self-existence, then that's how we know that it is not our true self. And that's how we know that it's not what carries on from life to life. Because whatever consciousness depends upon ceases, definitely at the end of each life, but again, at the end of each moment. So then he says, does doubt arise from uncertainty about whether or not, with the cessation of that source, what has come into existence is also the nature to cease? In other words, he's saying if you don't recognize that consciousness depends upon other phenomena which are arising and ceasing, then you might also not recognize that consciousness itself is impermanent and temporary. Consciousness itself is constantly arising and ceasing. And therefore, there's no ongoing consciousness. It's actually a series of separate consciousnesses which appear as a string. But if you don't recognize that consciousness is dependent upon temporary phenomena, then you might not also recognize that consciousness itself is impermanent and temporary. And then the Buddha says, is that doubt abandoned when one accurately sees with proper wisdom that this has come into existence? In other words, when you clearly see that consciousness has arisen in this moment, that it wasn't a persistent phenomenon that's always been around, but rather it's a temporary phenomenon that's arisen in this moment based upon the presence of sensory fields. And they say, yes, Bhante. Yes, is that doubt abandoned when one accurately sees with proper wisdom that this exists because of that source? And they say, yes, Bhante. And is that doubt abandoned when one accurately sees with proper discernment that with the cessation of that source, what has come into existence is also the nature to cease? And they say, yes, Bhante. So again, he's affirming, when you really pay close attention to consciousness, you recognize that it depends upon outside causes and it's subject to arising and ceasing. It's an impermanent, temporary, momentary phenomenon. There is no persistent, ongoing consciousness. There is just a series of moments of consciousness, which we mistake as being a single persistent, ongoing entity. And they confirm, yes, Bhante. And yes, are you free of doubt about these three things? And they say, yes, Bhante. So this may mean that these monks were affirming stream entry. So complete freedom from doubt about the temporary, impermanent nature of all things comes with stream entry. Because through stream entry, one clearly sees yang kenchi samudaya dhammang sabantang nirodha dhammanti. One clearly sees that everything which has the nature of arising also has the nature of ceasing. In other words, a personal, direct experiential understanding of impermanence comes only with stream entry. But prior to that, one can still have faith that all things are impermanent. So faith that comes through careful consideration, faith that comes through logical examination of the teachings, based upon some amount of personal experience. So through limited personal experience, one can apply logic and contemplation and come to a faith in the Buddha's teachings on impermanence. So either the monks he's talking to are already stream enterers, or they have sufficient knowledge of the Dhamma and sufficient faith that they understand the Buddha's teachings on this point, that consciousness is a temporary conditional arising, and therefore it cannot be persistent from life to life, and it cannot be our true self. And he asks, has it been well seen, these 3 points? And they reply, yes, Bhante. And he says, monks, this perspective is pure and bright. So in Pali, parisuddha, which means completely pure, and bright, pariyodhata. Pariyodhata also means clean, untainted. So he's affirming that this understanding that all things, including consciousness, are dependently arisen, impermanent, temporary, not our true self. That understanding is a completely pure understanding, completely wholesome, completely clean. It's something which leads to the highest purity of mind, and something which conduces to complete awakening. So he says, this perspective is pure and bright. However, if you adhere to it, cherish it, treasure it, and treat it as yours, would this be a proper way for you to understand the Dhamma that has been taught for the sake of escaping and not for the sake of grasping? And they reply, certainly not, Bhante. In other words, the Buddha is saying there is this viewpoint, this belief, and it's great. However, if you cling to it and see it as a personal possession, so I possess this right view, would that be a correct understanding? Would that lead to escaping samsara? They say no, Bhante. So the Buddha is saying even attachment and clinging and self-identity in relation to the Dhamma is going to be ultimately an obstacle for you. So even more so, attachment and clinging and self-identity in relation to something so obviously temporary and impersonal as consciousness. So he says, this perspective is pure and bright. However, if you do not adhere to it, cherish it, treasure it, and treat it as yours, would this be a proper way for you to understand the Dhamma? And they reply, yes, Bhante. In other words, he's emphasizing here that one should not latch onto and create a self-identity around even the Dhamma, let alone anything so obviously temporary as the five khandhas. So at this time, I'd like to go ahead and take some questions. So the Buddha is about to switch next into step-by-step analysis of dependent origination, which that's going to take some time. So for now, I'd like to go ahead and pause and take any questions that you might have.
Annamayam Dhammakataya Sadhukaram Nadamase
Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
Thank you, Bhante, for sharing the words of Buddha this morning. Very instructive, and welcome to all our friends that are watching. Hello to Gita, Michael, Melissa, Shadow of Label, Jorge, Ian, Abhishek, Anita, Karam, Samyak, lots of friends. Hello, Sam, and Boy, all of them who are checking in and saying hello. So Michael says, yesterday I stopped by a small band of Hare Krishna guys, one who explained to me that upon rebirth, the soul inherits the karma from this life. Soul as a stand-in for consciousness, since he used that word too as a synonym. This is the very failing that Venerable Sati brings to the table. So timing for this sutta is excellent for me.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Michael also says, I find correction welcome from teachers I respect, including public shaming. But from those whose practice I don't respect, feelings of defense, anger, resentment begin to rise. How to deal with this best? Kindly guide me here.
Well, first off, recognizing that defensiveness is coming from your ego, from your self-attachment, because you think, I am one who knows the Dhamma. This person is incorrectly attacking me and my understanding of Dhamma. So ultimately, it comes down to your sense of me and mine. And it gets a bit more complicated because what you're attached to is something which is wholesome, actually, which is a correct understanding of the Dhamma. So it's very wholesome. As the Buddha is saying here, even if you cling to and have a self-identity of this is my understanding of the Dhamma, then that clinging and self-identity ultimately will prevent you from attaining awakening. So when somebody else who you maybe don't respect so much is publicly criticizing your understanding of Dhamma, then yeah, of course, Of course you're going to have a ego reaction. So then your practice is to listen to what they're saying and see if there's any truth and value in it. If what they're saying actually does contain some usefulness to you, then you can have gratitude and appreciation that they've helped point something out. Even somebody who's not themselves a good practitioner can still sometimes give us pointers. They can still sometimes help us see our own blind spots. So we should be grateful for their efforts, especially if it helps us see some part of our practice we need to work on. However, when you're reflecting upon the instruction they're giving, if you think, actually, this person has not understood correctly, they've misunderstood the Dhamma, or they don't understand me correctly, they're admonishing me based upon a misunderstanding, then you know that you're blameless, and therefore there's nothing you need to worry about. You can disregard their admonishment because it's not relevant. Either it's an incorrect Dhamma or it's not a correct description of your conditions. So in that case, you don't need to be bothered because the person is striking at empty air. They're not hitting anything important. So in both cases, there's no need for getting upset or defensive. It is sometimes worth asking further questions, like asking Bhante, what is it that you see which makes you think this way? Or Bhante, please tell me more about the Buddha's teachings on this point so that I can understand more clearly. And again, maybe they'll tell you something that's helpful, or maybe they'll say things which you know are not accurate, in which case you don't need to be bothered. So you can see those kinds of situations as opportunities to work on enduring personal attack. So practicing letting go of your self-identity, your self-attachment, your ego clinging. And also a chance to investigate the Dhamma. Again, there's a chance that the person might actually have something to say which is helpful to you. Those are my thoughts on that question.
Thank you, Bhante. And Anita says, some traditions refer to universal consciousness. What do they mean?
I don't know, because universal consciousness isn't really spoken about in the Pali Canon. So what is mentioned is the idea of vijnana dhatu, the consciousness element, which is an aspect of the natural world. But is it universal consciousness? Well, again, it depends on what somebody means by that. Also, we see spoken about the Brahma Devas. So the Brahma Devas can have consciousness so large that it encompasses multiple solar systems, multiple galaxies, even up to the level of entire universes. So that's a very large mind, but it's still a temporary conditional consciousness, and it's also ultimately not true self. There can also be the experience of infinite consciousness through deep samadhi or through certain rebirth. One can experience what seems to be an infinite consciousness, but that also is just another temporary experience. That's not our true self. So we don't normally talk about universal consciousness in Buddhism. So if you gave some clarification on how that term is used elsewhere, then we could talk about whether or not it's relevant to Buddhism.
All right, thank you, Bhante. Anita also asks, can you please type the Pali sentence on everything arises that you mentioned?
Yen kenchi samudaya dhammang sabantang nirodha dhammang. It's in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. That's one of the most well-known locations of finding it. So at the end of the Buddha's discourse, then this is what Venerable Kondanya realized. And it was this realization which was synonymous with his attainment of stream entry.
All right, and then there is Sia, who's asking, how does the pure mind, pure awareness mentioned in some Mahayana traditions, for example, Dzogchen, fit into this teaching from the Buddha?
So it should be first off explained that I'm not that familiar with how terminology is used in Tibetan Buddhism. So I would have to start with definition of terms. I'd have to start by asking, what do you mean by pure mind? How are you using this term? And then we can talk about it, about its relevance to the teachings in the Pali Canon. So I'd have to start by getting a definition of terms before I could give any clear answer for that.
Do you know what this not dependent pure awareness Buddha nature is that some Mahayana Buddhists talk about? Yeah.
So the only thing which is not dependent, which is not conditional, is Nibbana itself. So the Nibbana Dhatu, the element of the unconditioned. So as far as I can tell, the Mahayana concepts of Buddha mind or the unconditional awareness, they're talking about Nibbana Dhatu, which is not consciousness. It cannot be defined as vijnana because vijnana by its very nature, as it says in the sutta, is conditional. It's conditioned. It's a causal temporary phenomenon. So therefore, it cannot be the unconditioned. It cannot be the Nibbana Dhatu. And this also means that Buddha mind cannot be a form of consciousness. Because if it was, then it would be temporary and conditional and therefore not the unconditioned. So as far as I can tell, this concept of Buddha mind is the Nibbana Dhatu itself. Buddha nature, on the other hand, in Chinese, it's called Foxing, which means the quality of the Buddha that we all have. So we all have within us the quality of awakening, the characteristic of being able to be a Buddha, which is even more clear in the Sanskrit origin of that term, which is Tathagata Garbha. So Garbha literally means womb. So Tathagata Garbha means all of us are the womb of a Tathagata, which means every single one of us has the ability to give birth to a Buddha. And that doesn't mean in a physical sense of producing a Buddha from your womb, but rather in a metaphorical sense of meaning that our mind can become a Buddha. Just as a womb grows a baby within it, in the same way, our own mind can grow a Buddha. We can grow a Buddha within our own mind, slowly transforming our own mind into the mind of an awakened being. So that's the concept of Buddha nature. Buddha nature is referring to the fact that all of us have the same inherent qualities and characteristics in nature as a Buddha. And all of us have the ability to manifest the qualities and aspects of a Buddha. But that's not even remotely close to the wrong view of Venerable Sati that we find in this discourse.
Thank you, Bhante. And Bobby asks, is dependent origination impermanent?
Dependent origination itself is a concept. But the process that's happening is the process of temporary conditional phenomenon, which each of which is itself impermanent. So I'm not quite sure what you mean when you say, is dependent origination impermanent? So maybe you could clarify.
Maybe is impermanence impermanent?
Well, Bhante Ji would say impermanence is permanent. Everything is permanently impermanent.
Sadhu. Hello, Putrika. Harmeet, good to see you, friend. And Anita also asks, Bhante, would you say the awareness keeps changing depending on the senses? Like in a moment, one can see a split of awareness with everything else. Is that something that is possible?
So yeah, consciousness is constantly changing moment by moment. I'm not sure what you mean by a split of awareness.
I don't know.
You mean in the sense of, can you have be aware of multiple things at the same time? I mean, traditionally, based upon specifically the Abhidhamma commentaries, then the answer would be no. There can only be one consciousness present in each moment. You can't have multiple consciousnesses in each moment.
She's saying universal consciousness like oneness in a moment, in the here and now.
So there is such a thing as oneness and the experience of oneness, but it's not the goal of Buddhism. So the Buddha, for example, in the Mulapariyaya Sutta and in the Brahmajala Sutta and a few other places, he says that there is the view that everything is one, so all is one. But that's not quite correct. That's not the ultimate view. Similarly, in the Chan schools of Buddhism, they say not one, not two, or the other way around, not two, not one. So in other words, it's not correct to say that all is one, but it's also not correct to say that everything is made up of separate objects. So each viewpoint is only giving a limited perspective. So from one perspective, you can say everything is one, but from another perspective, you can say, well, that's not true. Everything is composed of separate, distinct objects. But that's not correct, because all objects are dependent upon other objects. They're dependent upon everything else. So then everything is interconnected. And that's how you can come to say everything is one. But what we're trying to do actually is to drop these concepts of unity and plurality, because they're just concepts that prevent us from seeing the truth. So the truth is a perfect unity of these two concepts. It's a perfect blend of unity and plurality. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bhante. By the way, Anita had also typed in the quote that you were asking for earlier. So you can find it in the live chat. And Shadow Label asks, are blind people not visually conscious and others who suffer from lack of senses, unfortunately?
I recommend asking a blind person. So I recall reading many, many years ago, so the details are lost to me at this time. But I recall reading many, many years ago some interviews with people born blind. And actually, they described seeing flashes of light and color and shape, but not in the same way that we see them. So it's many people, it's not that they're completely 100% blind, but rather that their visual capacities are operating on an extremely minimal level, so that they're not able, they're functionally not able to be visually aware as we are, as most people are. But that doesn't mean that their visual domain is completely non-functional. But as again, look it up for yourself. I don't remember the details. But yeah, is there no visual consciousness operating? Well, if there's no eyes, then yeah. Or if the eyes are not working at all, then yeah, that would mean there is no visual consciousness operating.
All right, thank you, Bhante. And that was the last question for this morning. Thank you so much again for sharing the teachings. And we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So tomorrow we will have the second part of this sutta study with Bhante Suddhaso, but this evening we'll have the second part also of the teachings on dependent origination by Bhante Rahula. So there will be at 7:30 p.m. New York City time. Tune in live to listen to Bhante Rahula. He's a very senior monk. He's been a monk for about like 50 years or so. And you will also have the opportunity to ask Bhante Rahula questions live. And then tomorrow evening, there will be a Sangha panel discussion here on the teachings of the Buddha on dependent origination. So lots of opportunities to also ask questions there. And then Friday morning, we'll have a Sutta study on a different topic with Venerable Vimalanyani. So she will be sharing teachings on Baddha Kapilani from the Ekotarika Agama, part of the Pali Canon in the Chinese. And then monk chat, of course, as usual, on a Friday evening, 7:30 p.m. New York City time. So if you have questions that are not related to Baddha Kapilani or dependent origination, you can bring them to monk chat at 7:30 p.m. on Friday. And as usual, this weekend, if you are in New Jersey, you can come in person to the monastery. So there will be at 6 p.m. Our usual meditation on the lawn here at Empty Cloud Monastery. And on Sunday in the afternoon, there will be an afternoon of mindfulness. So you're welcome to come and practice with the Sangha in real life. And there's also the opportunity to join last minute week-long retreat offered by Bhante Suddhaso that will be starting on the day of the Upasana on Monday. So if for more information on that, you can just send us an email. All right. Well, good to see you also, Jen Wallace, who was tuned in. All right, to say hello. Long time no see. All right. See you all soon. May you all be well, happy, and peaceful, and may you all swiftly attain awakening.